Hello and welcome to the Construction Record Podcast. I'm digital media editor Warren Frey. On this episode of the podcast, we talk to Gensler Senior Associate Duanne Render about the challenges and opportunities of converting office spaces into residential to address an ongoing affordable housing crisis. But first, here's the latest headlines from the Daily Commercial News and the Journal of Commerce. From the East, DCN staff writer Don Wall has a story about how the federal government recently released a document titled Powering Canada Forward, promising a clean energy strategy to be released in 2024. But the policy announcements are getting some industry pushback as Electricity Canada President and CEO Francis Bradley says they, quote, don't do anything with respect to making it easier to build things, end quote. Staff writer Angela Gismondi profiles the Parliament & Co. project in Toronto, located at Parliament and Queen Streets and inspired by the city's warehouses and artist lofts from the 60s and 70s. Parliament & Co. in the historic Corktown neighborhood is a mixed-use development designed by Cone Partnership Architects. The developers are the Downing Street Group and the Shure Corporation, and the construction manager is Grove Street Management Inc. From the West, we have a story about how Federal Housing Minister Sean Fraser is saying the federal government should have never got out of the housing business, even as some high-income professionals are struggling to find affordable housing. He says federal governments over the past half-century, both liberal and conservative, stepped away from the file, and now much of the country is dealing with the housing crunch that has no easy fixes. And I have a story up about Janine Martin, the new president of the Vancouver Regional Construction Association, and her goals as she steps into her new role. You can also hear an interview with Janine on episode 294. That's it for the news, but up next is my interview with Duanne Render. Enjoy. And you're from Gensler, and what Gensler has done is they've studied basically the idea and the practice of taking office buildings and converting them into residential, which has gained a lot more traction over the pandemic and given an affordable housing crisis, not just here, but pretty much everywhere in the world. So let's start with that. How did Gensler start with this study? And I think the initial idea was you're playing with an algorithm, and it kind of pointed you in a certain direction.
Yeah, in a nutshell, yes. But I also just want to highlight, as many people know, office to residential conversions is not something new. It's been done all over the world for a number of years, long before the pandemic. And the pandemic just kind of exacerbated things. But the pandemic also didn't started off again. Actually, before the pandemic, we were chatting to a couple of clients, and there was a general concern of what vacancy rates were doing in general, especially in Class B and C office buildings. And the big question for them always was, how are they going to protect their value? Because it was a trend that was kind of increasing and going up over the last 10 years to 15 years now, really. And the pandemic exacerbated that. We saw during the pandemic, on average, about 4 to 5 basis point increase in vacancy in general. And then obviously the pandemic also brought on this new, today at least we know this new work from home phenomenon, which in itself has reduced occupancy in buildings dramatically, as we all know. So that all spurred on. We started reaching out to our clients. We spoke to them. This was the issue that they had. And considering the volume and the kind of scale of the problem, we very quickly realized that we needed to be able to look at this very quickly and analyze it very quickly. So we focused in on the metrics, the data behind looking at office buildings and residential buildings and understanding what that compatibility could be for conversion. And the city of Calgary actually saw some of the work that we were doing and some of the publications we were putting out into the media, and they reached out. Considering then the scale of their problem, which started well before the pandemic, with the oil and gas crash and crisis and so on, and the exodus out of the city of Calgary, we looked and we analyzed a lot of their properties with the algorithm, and also kind of built and refined it through that process. And today, as probably a lot of the listeners know, Calgary has a incentive scheme in place that provides $75 in grant funding to developers to convert. I think you covered one of those conversions in one of your previous. Okay. Fantastic. And, they're currently converting, I think it's 10 or 11 properties. So that's really in a nutshell how it started.
And so you've, I think 1,000 buildings you've is it cataloging or is it analyzing? What are you doing when you're doing these studies of these buildings? What are you looking for?
Yeah, you're actually right with the number. We're close on 1,000 buildings across North America now. Some into Europe, into the Far East as well. A couple in Singapore and so on and so forth. And basically, what we do is we have a look at the key characteristics of office buildings. In relation to the key characteristics of residential buildings. We analyze that through running it through the algorithm, and it then basically gives us a compatibility score for lack of a better description. The different elements that we look at ranges all the way from quarter window distance, shape of building, size of floor plate, how walkable is the location that the building is situated in, does it have access to natural light, and so on and so forth. All of these different aspects are weighted on a relative cost basis. So, if you imagine anything that's going to increase the cost of a conversion is weighted heavily in the negative direction, and anything that's going to increase the quality and the desirability of your end product of the building, of the units, is weighted heavily in the positive direction. And that then starts creating a very, very important relationship with the performer, to economically make it work. So, you may end up with a building that has very deep leaf steps, window to core distances, which doesn't necessarily work for an ideal residential unit proportion. Okay, you generally want to aim for a certain depth depending on market and a certain width depending on market, and that building may not necessarily suit that. If you end up with a building like that, that's going to score negatively. It's going to score relatively low on the algorithm, and that's going to give you an indication of, number one, whether it's going to work economically. Are you going to get good average unit sizes? Are you going to get good rentals? Are you going to get good cost per unit or cost per square foot to convert a building? And that, together with the efficiency and so on, then play into how a building scores. And just to be clear, this algorithm isn't a silver bullet by any means. It doesn't necessarily say that this building is going to work. It gives you a good indication to make a decision whether you want to analyze and dive in deeper into the analysis of a potential project. Because thereafter, when you start going into that analysis, you may find that it still doesn't work. And that's the unfortunate fact, because there are so many other factors that then come into play. Like you probably found that in your discussions on the Neoma project. Property value basis, it is one of the biggest drivers that makes a conversion work. If you're looking to purchase a property to convert, and you can get it at the right value, at the right price point, your compatibility actually starts to is less important, because financially you can possibly afford to have a less efficient layout, if you understand what I'm.
Yeah.
On the other side of the coin is, you may have the perfect building physically, but if the property value is just not there, you're not going to make it work, So one little last tidbit of information, out of our analysis of looking at this close on 1,000 buildings now, we have landed on approximately 25% of what we've analyzed makes sense to study as a potential conversion. Out of that 20%, we feel that, maybe 5 to 10% of them could go ahead. So you're looking at cutting that down because of all of these different factors relatively quickly on the scale, and it kind of brings up this question: what do you do with the rest of the buildings that don't work? Because converting to residential is not the silver bullet. It's not going to solve all the problems.
Well, that's another thing. This came up with the Neoma, but I'm sure it comes up with other things. There are physical challenges to it. In that particular instance, it was really pressed in with other buildings, so it was tough to get in and build in. But also in the interior, in this particular case, but I'm sure this applies to others, you've got these sort of, those tiled roofs where you can go in, and there's great data networking, which is only one thing you need if you live there. But there's one bathroom per floor, or they're not set up for people to live because they never were, right? So it's not the no-brainer people think it is.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Generally when you talk about, the one bathroom and so on, when you start speaking about the servicing in these buildings, the MEP systems, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, firstly, office buildings capacity requirements, especially on plumbing, for example, is much lower than a residential building. So, not only do you need to look at the infrastructure within the building and usually introduce brand new infrastructure, you also need to consider the municipal connections, because a lot of the time the connection of the building to the city's infrastructure is just not big enough. So that's another challenge that often needs to be considered. And mechanical systems are often not suited for residential products. So in some cases, you may be able to partially retain a mechanical system, but in a lot of cases, you need to just assume that you're going to be replacing all of it. It also brings up the discussion around the envelope and the facade. What do you do with the facade? Is the facade suitable? Acoustically, you need to consider separation between units when you look at the facade. You need to look at thermal considerations. Some markets require operable windows, some don't necessarily, but often the market dictates and they want, tenants want operable windows. So how does that affect your marketing at the end of the day? How easy is it for you to lease buildings or lease the units? But then at the same time, you face all of these challenges in converting office buildings, but then there is also sometimes real opportunity for us to take advantage of, often cases, and I'll use what I always refer to as our Goldilocks office to resi conversion, Franklin Tower in Philadelphia. Now that building faced a particular challenge in the size of the floor plate. It had all of the other challenges, the envelope, the MEP systems, and so on and so forth. But, arguably, one of the most important factors in a conversion is the efficiency of a floor plate. How many units can you fit into a floor plate that suit the market's needs? And in some cases, increasing a yield, number of units that you can fit on the floor within the market's demands, the parameters, sizes, unit, bedroom count, and so on and so forth. It can make or break a project if you go up or down by 10 units, okay? For example. Now, in Franklin Tower, we had a very large floor plate and a lot of dead space in the center of the floor plate that you can't convert into residential units. What do you do with that central space? So what we did is we took the opportunity and we stacked amenity up in the center of the floor plate, amenity that doesn't need access to natural light. And that did two things. Number one, it freed up, a floor that you would traditionally make available or dedicate to amenity. And we were able to add more units on that floor, i.e. increasing the overall efficiency of the building while over amenitizing the building effectively. And that over amenitization is one of the factors, there's many factors that encouraged tenants to sign up and move into the building. And today it's getting best in class rentals and it's, doing very, very well. And that talks to that idea of opportunity. And we must always look at these office buildings from a point of view of saying, what are the distinguishing factors that we can take advantage of in order to create a unique offering and really create a quality space for, people to live in, dealing with a housing crisis and just creating great homes for people.
What's the response been from developers and builders and just the industry generally, because they kind of face this intractable, what we all do, face this intractable problem of affordable housing, and I'm working from home right now. There's no office to go back to, and I'm not the only person who's going through this, I'm sure. So it's a thing we've got to deal with in some way, but like you said, it's not quite as simple as it appears to be.
So their response has generally been, first of all, some. From an office vacancy point of view, there's no officer to go back to and so on and so forth. There are some camps that think that it's going to improve, it's going to come back. And there are some camps that think it's not going to come back. So what do? Do you try and deal with the problem now by looking at a conversion? Oftentimes, financially, it just doesn't pencil because, again, coming back to what I mentioned earlier about property value and basis, and obviously on the other side of the coin, what are the rentals that you can achieve, and what is the or if you're selling the units, what is the ultimate sell price that you can get? So you're sitting in a situation, or many are sitting in the situation where they have an asset that they can't fill with office tenants. But on the other hand, converting it is also not penciling. So what do you do? Do you like we've seen in a lot of cases some property owners default on their mortgages, or just handing back the keys. Or do you take the route of saying, okay, over the next 5 years, we're possibly going to be losing money, but at that point, we'll be breaking even, and then long term, we'll probably have a good asset. If you have a Class B and C office, or Class B or C office building, which doesn't have really much of a hope of being a good Class A office building in the future. Right. Sure, there are strategies that you can reposition and try and compete with the Class A office buildings, which, interestingly as well, is doing much better generally in markets than Class B and C. So it's important to just understand. I kind of digress here a little bit, but it's important to understand. It's important to understand that office vacancy is not across the board. It's not even across the board. It's not evenly spread. It's more concentrated in your lower class office stock. And generally, why? Because as leases come up, why wouldn't tenants go to the best office offerings that they can get within a market, and best locations, and so on and so forth? So your better class, your better quality buildings, office buildings, are generally doing better. And that brings me back to, if you are able to reposition, if you have a Class C, B, or C office buildings that has the right characteristics to really reposition and upgrade effectively to be able to compete with the Class A office buildings, you maybe have a hope. But if you don't have those characteristics and you're not able to compete, what do you do? So you're going to be looking at converting, you're going to be looking at disposing, and so on and so forth. I don't want to speak for our developer clients on the call. They can probably give a whole lot more color in terms of what the strategies would be there. But that's kind of where they're sitting at the moment, or at least what our perception is of where they're sitting. From a contractor's point of view, from a constructor's point of view, there's also various different challenges in doing these, as you probably found in Noma again. It is not typical. It is not a typical construction project. Your sequencing is different. Your considerations in terms of how do you get material inside, where do you put the materials, do you need to remove a facade? When you're removing a facade, you're removing it with blow torches and hammers and screwdrivers. You're not just demolishing it traditionally. And then, from a developer's point of view, there's a cost attached to that removal as well. So, it is a challenging thing to do from everybody's perspective, but it's definitely not impossible. And also, if you consider a conversion, it's really made up of 3 primary elements. One being your interior fit out. What are the interiors of the units? Your mechanical systems and your envelope. That's really what it comes down to. If you're taking an existing building and you're converting it into residential, and if you break it down into those 3 elements, it maybe starts to become a little bit less daunting, if you know what I mean. Because a lot of clients, a lot of people in the industry of all different vocations are, they're like, we haven't done this before. How do we do this? And if you kind of start thinking about on a principle by principle basis, as one saying goes, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. That's how you need to approach this, little, like, step by step. And that's why we have this approach of running a property through an algorithm. Does it make sense to take a next step? Then we look at a yield study, understand what the efficiencies, what can we get out of the building? Then we have a look at a ROM costing together with a trusted partner to see whether it, passes that initial feasibility, economic feasibility test. Then you really have the information to be able to say, yes, this is worth studying further or not. And then you get really stuck into the nuts and bolts, building conditions, so on and so forth. And it's, that kind of sequential process. So you're not making a huge commitment in the beginning, from a time point of view, from a cost point of view, so that we can really get down to understand whether these buildings, what buildings rather, are going to work as conversions or not. And that would be my message to everybody is, do it step by step.
Okay, and I'm sure the listeners are interested in finding out more about this and maybe even using your services. Where should they go to find public data that you've put out and just generally to find out more what Gensler is doing?
So generally speaking, I'm happy to field any kind of queries, or if anybody wants to reach out to me. But we've got quite a lot of information on our website about our approach. We've put out a couple of blog posts that shares some of our findings and what we've learned throughout the process. And there is we're also working on new content as well that we'll also be publishing and sending out and sharing with the greater public in the near future as well. So keep an eye out for that.
Okay, great. Thanks for joining us today, Duanne.
You're very welcome, Warren, and thank you so much for having me. I hope this was informative and useful.
Very much so. And that's it for this episode of the Construction Record Podcast. You can hear us on Apple Music, Amazon Music, and Spotify, as well as daily commercial news and Journal of Commerce websites. Thanks for listening.